Hey everybody, welcome back to Leading in the Gospel. I'm Cary, and it's been a minute, and that's because we just got busy at the end of 2023, and then we got into the holiday season, and so we anticipated some more podcasts right now. And so Happy New Year. This is our first podcast of 2024, and I'm excited in a minute to introduce my guest today to you. A lot has happened in the last few months, and so there's a few things I want to update you on and how we want to bless and encourage and serve you, okay? So first of all, starting with this episode, we're going to a video podcast as well as an audio podcast. So you can find the video for this on YouTube if you prefer to see the conversation as well as hear the conversation. You will be able to continue to find the audio wherever you find the audio. And so please don't feel like you have to switch. Just want you to know that's going to be available going forward. Secondly, we are very excited about the release of the second edition of Done, What Most Religions Never Tell You About the Bible. We have made some wonderful expansions to this resource. God gave this little book a life that I could have never imagined. And it's due for an update. And so we did not make any detractions. We did make some clarifications and some additional content in the book. It's probably 1,000 words longer, maybe a little less than that. I just took the questions that I've been asked over the last 15 to 20 years in the history of that book, the common questions, and tried to bring greater clarity to specific topics. And then we redesigned a beautiful little cover. And this second edition is coming off the press in the next couple of weeks. So please continue to use this book that you've trusted for the last 20 years. It's the same book, but with even greater clarity. And so you can get that starting. I've never been able to sell or resource this book. Lots of people have reached out to me. Hey, I want to order this book. I've never sold it. Well, we've organized In the Gospel Publishing as an entity. And so you can now get the Done book through inthegospel.com. And we will very shortly be available also on Amazon and Christian book distributors and other places where you like to purchase books. So look for the second edition of Done. Thirdly, I really need to tell you about the upcoming Leading in the Gospel Refuel Retreat for pastors and their wives at Disney World in October of 2024. So we are 7-8-ish months away from this. And we are looking forward to a fantastic time once again. Kurt Skelly will be with us. We will spend 4 days outside of the Magic Kingdom at the Contemporary Resort. The retreat this year begins September 30th. So it's the last day of September, moving into the first week of October. And you can find information about this and lock up your room on inthegospel.com. And I encourage you to do that very soon because we are more broadly sending out the invitations this year, and I know that we will fill up. And at Disney always tells us we're not sure we can get more rooms. So please reserve your spot as soon as possible, and that will help us to be able to plan for you. And then finally, something that I've just undertaken this year as a personal project is a new YouTube channel called Growing in the Gospel. And this channel God's just given it a life that I did not anticipate or expect. And I'm very thankful for it. We are doing a lot of things on Growing in the Gospel. Probably the most important right now is called the 1-Year Bible Journey. It is a survey of Scripture as we read through the Bible over the course of the year. So on Monday, we're releasing an Old Testament comment on the reading for that week. And then on Tuesdays, the New Testament reading for that week. And it's commentary and sort of context. And then we're continuing Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to walk through the Psalms, slow walk devotionally through the Psalms. And then periodically throughout the week, I'm releasing longer form teaching series. One of the reasons I'm telling you all about this is that some of these series would be useful for small group studies. For instance, the Done book itself. All the videos for the Done book are on Growing in the Gospel and freely usable for you and your church. There's a series called Doing Decisions Right. It's designed for small group study. We can provide support materials like teaching outlines or the blank outlines for these series. And so I hope that you'll take a look at the playlists and the teaching series that are available on Growing the Gospel. And if you're looking for if you're looking for a trusted resource to refer your church family to for just simple expositional Bible teaching, then these resources would be useful for that. Growing in the Gospel on YouTube. And so there's so many things that I'd like to share with you, but I want to press into the content for today. This past November, a book that I wrote was published called Steady Strength. I'm going to do some upcoming podcast episodes on that. That book is about reversing ministry's dangerous drift toward depletion. It is now available through Moody Publishers, Amazon, wherever books are sold. Along the same time, my acquisitions editor and friend, Drew Dyck, was also writing a book called Just Show Up. And this book is written to the general Christian audience. It is filled with wisdom and practical encouragement about taking the journey through life that God calls you to take. Show up into God's call, into God's opportunities, even when they don't seem spectacular or over the top. Just show up into the call and the will of God for your life. So my guest today is Drew Dyck. We did an interview and we talked through the chapters of his book, and then very briefly at the end of the interview through the principles of steady strength. And I know that what we're going to talk about is going to encourage you right now. So I'll talk to you more about some of these resources and opportunities after the interview. But right now, let's go to the interview with my friend, Drew Dyck. Hey, everybody, I'm Cary, and welcome back to Leading in the Gospel. This is our first official video episode. I think we've done one or two videos over the years, but this is going forward, hopefully, the format. And my guest today, my first guest for the new year, is my friend Drew Dyck. Drew is acquisitions editor with Moody Publications and an expert in all things Christian. So Drew, welcome to Leading in the Gospel. Take a minute and introduce yourself to the listening audience of Leading in the Gospel.
Wow. Well, expert in all things Christian, that's quite a thing. My wife Grace once introduced me as a professional Christian, which I think was the biggest burn anyone could ever give you. But yeah, I am, as you know, Cary, because I edited your book. We'll talk about that later. I'm an acquisitions editor, and I also write books of my own. So I kind of burn the publishing candle on both ends. And what else should I tell people? Oh, I'm Canadian. Got to get that out of the way. I grew up, born and raised in Canada, but I've been south of the border now for 23 years. And so I have lost all my Canadian cred. When I go home, they say I sound like a Southern politician.
That's funny.
But those are my roots.
So we're going to get to talking about a book that you wrote and then a book that I wrote. And you had a lot to do with my book. I had absolutely nothing to do with your book, except for we were kind of running down the same path at the same time. But we're going to get to that. But before that, I'm intrigued to hear about your journey in Christian publishing and Christian leadership, because I know that's kind of been the lane you've been running in for your career. Tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it. You know, I was when I was young, I was into sports and not academics. I read my first book like all the way through when I was 18 after high school, and I barely eked through high school, got into college on a basketball scholarship, actually. And after going to college and sitting on the bench for a year, I realized I actually liked my studies more than basketball. So that's kind of when I discovered a love for reading and writing and literature. And I had these vague aspirations to be a writer. I didn't know what that meant or how that would work out. And I also loved studying about God. So I ended up going and getting a English degree, then went to seminary. And I'd dropped out a couple times in between there. It took longer than I thought it would. But anyway, and then I started writing for different publications, actually that's kind of how I got through seminary, was freelance writing for different magazines. And then I, after seminary, got a job as an editor of a magazine called New Man magazine, unfortunately no longer around, and it was tied to the Promise Keepers movement. And so that was kind of, my foray into publishing, and I worked for Christianity Today for 7-8 years, full-time, still have a small role with them, and then, of course, now at Moody Publishers. And basically, why do I do what I do? Honestly, it's because when I think back to my own spiritual journey, I think to books that I read at critical junctures in my life that were formative for me spiritually. And so I believe that God's still in the business of changing people through the medium of the written word. And so I feel honored to be able to get up every morning, put on my pajamas, because I work from home. See, this is my Zoom shirt, if you're watching the video.
I just wish you could have done something about your face. I mean, you should have done a little more work.
If you would have given me more notice that this is going to be a video thing, I could have done, my regular amount of primping, spent more time in hair and makeup, but less hair to work with these days. So anyway,
hey, look at me.
Yeah, okay, I'm in good company.
You're way ahead of the game.
No pun intended. Yes. Anyway, so I feel privileged to be able to, work with words, whether they're my own or wrestling with other people's words and editing, and hopefully equipping people. Especially, most of the books that I work on are for church leaders, for people in the trenches of ministry, and so I feel honored to be able to do that, and hopefully equip and help them.
So, talk about the role you serve with at Moody, and how did that materialize, and what is your heart for Christian leaders? That's one of the reasons I've got you on today's podcast.
Yeah, no, I'm an acquisitions editor, which is what it sounds like, looking at new ideas and book proposals. Some of those come directly from authors, some of them come through agents, and evaluating them. And people always say, what are you looking for? And I say, I don't know. Sometimes when you see it, right? And I don't make unilateral decisions. I basically have to bring book ideas and proposals to a publishing board. And then there's a whole process for evaluating whether we're going to take on a book or not. And then, of course, when a book gets the green light and the manuscript comes in, I'm doing the first edit on that. Mm-hmm. And then, as you know, the whole process, it's quite lengthy. And then it goes to a developmental editor and then copy editing and all the rest of it. But it's a very highly collaborative thing, publishing. Mm-hmm. And so, and the books are always better for it, I find. And then as far as, it's so varied, because I have worked on books on preaching, on leading, on pastoral care. And I feel like we're in a moment where I think we're seeing the fallout from the celebrity Christian leader mentality in some really vivid and sad ways, right?
Yeah,
Documentaries are being made about it. We're seeing,
right,
and we realize it's not just the case of a few bad apples. There's something about the whole edifice that was a little crumbly in the first place. Maybe the way we idolize certain folks or certain gifts without the character is often a problem. And I'm just hoping that in the books that I acquire and edit, that I can encourage the kind of integrity, the kind of deep spiritual life in Christian leaders that will ultimately result in long-term faithful ministry. And of course, that's what your book's all about. So excited to talk about that.
Yeah, and you were a big help to me in the whole process. Before we jump into the book you've just written, what word would you give to listeners? A lot of our listeners are pastors or Christian leaders, and a lot of times I get asked, hey, I would like to pursue writing, I'd like to pursue publishing. What would your advice be to that person who has an interest in what you do and what I do?
Yeah, go for it. A lot of people think that, like, okay, I got to do all these different things, or I have to be a leader of a huge ministry or a massive church, or I have to have this monster platform. Platform's part of it, I get that, but it's not everything. I mean, look at me. I don't lead a massive organization. Of course, I work in publishing, but the essential thing is that you're honing your craft. And here's the beauty about the time that we live in. It's really unique. It used to be, even 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to write to people, you had to go through the gatekeepers, the publishers. And then they made a decision. Okay, we're going to publish this and we'll take it out to the masses. Now that's gone. You can go right to readers. You can do Facebook posts and start a Facebook group. You can blog. You can, although social media has kind of killed blogs. But anyway, you can go on social media. You can self-publish. You can, there are many ways, or write articles for different outlets to try your hand at this. And it's a great way too to just connect directly with people and see what resonates as well. Because when someone comes to me with a book idea, often I'll say, hey, that's great. Have you written an article, or blogged at all? And sometimes they're like, no, I don't want to do any of that stuff. And I go, well, come on, you gotta crawl before you can walk, or whatever it is. So yeah, don't despise small beginnings. Start to get your words out there, see how it goes, and you never know where it could lead.
Yeah, that's similar to what I generally say. I have a friend named Barb. She was a longtime writer for Chuck Swindoll,
Oh, yeah.
and now she works for Through the Bible with J. Vernon McGee, which is really cool. She's just a great lady with a long history in Christian writing, and she told me, her words to me were, writing in the Christian world is like a moving stream,
Hmm.
and you have to step into it.
No, that's good.
You have to do anything you can to get your feet wet in the water and the flow, to, number one, hone your craft, and number two, just and you just said it, blogs, social media, articles for publications, or self-publishing, just getting in the flow, and getting started. And that my posture has always been not seeking the audience, but seeking to write the message and make it available. And then my attitude has been, God, you give it the audience if you want it to have one.
Yep.
You know? And you know as well as I do, Drew, if the audience is your end goal, like in terms of your identity, you're just setting yourself up for radical disappointment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the other thing I'd say. If you have interest in becoming a writer, especially in the Christian space, and you think it's going to lead to crushing fame and wealth, you're probably going to be disappointed. I'm sorry to say.
Extremely disappointed. Yeah. If they knew how vastly wealthy we are,
That's right,
because of our writing.
Cary, I can't leave my house, okay? Because I'll get mobbed by fans. But
yeah, every time I go anywhere. Okay, I was standing at Disney World with my wife watching the fireworks, and I turned around and everybody's got their phone up, recording the fireworks. And I looked at them and I said, no matter where we go, there they are, pointing the phones at me, and she just looks at me and looks at me and yeah, exactly. She looks at me and rolls her eyes like, oh, brother. So yeah, we joke about that often. Lots of people want to have written a book, but not many people actually want to write a book, right?
Yeah, I'm one of them, though. I got to confess.
Do the work.
I say, like, writing is like hitting your head against a wall. It feels good when you stop. So, but you gotta go through that pain. Absolutely.
My favorite kind of writing is the writing that no one's going to read, because then I can just say what I want to say and let it flow, right. And no one's ever going to see it. So, okay. Well, with that said, let's talk about your book, and I'm happy to commend to our listeners this book, Just Show Up: How Small Acts of Faithfulness Change Everything. And I don't even know what you call this, a subtitle, a guide for exhausted Christians. And I want to right out of the gate recommend to the pastors and leaders that are listening, hey, think of this book for small groups or for group study as we talk through this, because I think this is the topic. I think this topic could touch a lot of nerves, not only in our hearts, but in the hearts of those we shepherd and lead. So, Drew, why this book? What was the motive and the life event behind this book?
Yeah. Well, it's a little embarrassing, but it might have been a little bit of a midlife crisis. Because, I talk about in the introduction how I was remembering back to the days when my wife and I went to seminary, and we had these very big, grandiose plans about what we were going to do for God, how we were going to change the world. I remember talking to her, saying to her, like, Grace, I don't want the American dream. Like, we're not going to have 2.5 kids and live in the suburbs with a white picket fence. And she was totally down with it. And you're laughing because you know how this ends. Here I am 18 years later in the suburbs with 3 kids, not 2.5, a minivan, which I love, by the way. Don't get me going on minivans.
Full of toys.
A front yard full of toys. No white picket fence yet, but, we'll price it out and see. And then the question becomes, okay, well, what does faithfulness look like now? And don't get me wrong, my life has turned out great. I'm so blessed. But it didn't look like I thought it would, which was like selling all my possessions and moving to, overseas and doing something really dramatic and spectacular. Yeah. And the conclusion I've come to is that, man, it's about faithfulness. And sometimes that looks very ordinary. And this was really driven home to me too when I was talking to Grace, and she asked me to list the people I most admired. And as I did, I realized not one of them was famous or, incredibly revolutionary in what they did. Like one was a small church pastor who kept leading his church despite being diagnosed with a debilitating illness. Another was a woman who led a soup kitchen, and she kept leading it even after her husband died. And I thought, like, why do I admire these people? Because they persevered, right?
Yeah.
They obeyed God. They kept getting up and coming back and obeying God and pressing on. And so that's kind of where I got the title, Just Show Up, because it's something I've started to repeat to myself. Like, hey, Drew, even when you're tired, you're discouraged, you feel inadequate, whatever it is, just show up. Just do the next thing in front of you that you feel God's calling you to do.
As I have looked through your book, I am delighted actually that you and I both wrote to similar themes.
Absolutely.
I was amazed at that in terms of maybe slightly different audiences, but the idea that I brought out in Steady Strength was obedience. Just fall in love with that every day doing what is right, what God's given you to do that's right in your life, and let God write the story. And that speaks to what you're talking about, just learning to show up and be who God calls you to be, even though it's not who you thought you were. So dive into to this first part, joining the plotters. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, I got that from William Cary. There's a great quote from him where he says, "I have no special talent, but I can plod." And I love that, right? And of course, look at father of modern missions. He did all these incredible things.
Yeah.
But when you look at his life carefully, like if you zoomed in on any one given day of his life, you wouldn't see him doing spectacular things. You'd see him just faithfully plodding, doing the next thing in front of him. And there are all these great stories about him. I think he held these open air services where he'd preach, and it was 6 or 8 years before he had one convert. But the guy was just determined. And I love that because I think it's a good message, especially in our time too, when you can go online, you go on Instagram, you see people blowing up overnight, becoming a big deal or famous or whatever. Yeah. And sometimes it's easy to kind of go, wow, okay, what happened? Did I miss the memo here? But you know what? The truth is, usually that's an illusion, what you see online anyway. Right. And the truth is, if you are going to have some sort of impact with your life, whether it's going to be big or small, it's going to happen through that plodding, that faithful obedience. Even in spite of hardship and difficulty and discouragement. But if you keep being faithful, it is amazing what God can do through you. And a good way to think of it, at least for me, is like not always looking at the metrics, not whether it's the size of your church or the number of sales of your book or whatever it is, whatever your metric is. We all have them, right?
Yeah.
And man, I struggle with this. It's kind of like the sin of census that David does, when he counts all the fighting men, when you're always looking at the outcomes. But something that's been good for my soul is like try to abandon the outcomes to God. Be faithful and abandon the outcomes to God.
I like when Jesus sent his disciples out and they did ministry and then they came back. And you remember they were elated. They were overjoyed. And they asked him how it went. And I'm paraphrasing. They said, it was awesome. Even the devils are subject to us. And he lovingly and gently rebuked them. And his rebuke was, don't rejoice that the devils are subject to you. Rejoice that your name is written in heaven.
Yeah.
And that speaks to what you're talking about. Don't rejoice in your abilities or the outcomes you can produce. Rejoice in the truth of my love for you and the security that the gospel gives you. Let the gospel be your core source of joy and validity and meaning. So you move in chapter 2 to talking about the idea of presence. And I really am looking forward to hearing your words on this. Show up in person. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, another thing that's so important, especially in the time that we're in, right, where it's so easy, and I realize the irony because we're talking through the internet right now, but with social media and all the ways you can check out, and like for me, I work from home. It's really easy for me to completely be, physically absent from people, because I most of my meetings are on Zoom, and even it's hilarious. You may have seen this if you do a lot of Zoom meetings with people. You'll see people even turn off their camera because that's too much, right? So you just communicate as disembodied voices, and so I realize that is a tendency in my life. And yet when I succumb to it, when I'm just like always on my phone and I don't go and hang out with people, don't serve people, don't love people in person. I feel less human and kind of numb. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is where I go in that chapter. I talk about, we are people of the incarnation. God showed up for us in person in the person of Jesus. And of course, that was because Jesus had to come to earth to die for our sins, but it was also fundamental to his ministry, right? Mm-hmm. He, you think of like he touched diseased people. When he taught, people were like pressing against him. He had, prostitutes touching his feet and kids jumping on his lap. Physical presence was a huge part of Jesus's ministry. And so, I think sometimes the most Jesus-y thing we can do, I know that's not a word, but is to show up for people, especially when they're going through a hard time. I have an anxiety disorder. Sometimes it's better than others, but a couple of years ago, I was at a super low place. It was around Christmas, I remember. And I get a text from my brother who lives about half an hour away, and he says, I'm going to come and pick you up in 30 minutes. And he comes and grabs me, and then he tells me about his plan. He said, we're going to go buy a whole bunch of coats and hand them out to the homeless folks in downtown Portland. And so it was a really, really cold day. And we went to Costco, loaded up with all these coats, and then handed them out. But of course, I realized that I think the real purpose of his little mission was to help me. And that's what I needed. I needed to get out of the house because I'd been like pacing around the house, unable to sleep, thinking about my own problems. It helped to like go and see people with real problems compared to mine, and try to help them a little bit. And it just helped tremendously. And it wouldn't have happened, though, if my brother hadn't shown up for me physically, right? It's great to send a text or just call someone or leave a broken heart emoji on their social media feed. But man, there's nothing better than that physical presence. And don't get me ranting, I'm almost done. But the church is so crucial in this regard because we're the last bastion of physical presence and fellowship. And our culture is desperate for it. You see the rates of loneliness and isolation and anxiety just going through the roof. And we have a tremendous opportunity to combat that.
A healthy church brings something to our lives that nothing else in society can provide.
Right.
And I tell our church that all the time. If they don't find love here and grace and fellowship and community in a gospel way, where would they ever find it in the world? It just doesn't exist. Okay, we got to move quick. So chapter 3 is finding God's will with your feet, and I know where you're going here. So nail us to the wall. This is a great thought.
Yeah, and it's just a silly way of saying, at least in my experience, when I look back on my life, I would love to say that I heard a voice from heaven about what I should do next or what I should be and where I should go. But often I find that God leads, and God can do that. He can miraculously guide people. Don't get me wrong. It happens all through Scripture, and I've heard great stories. But in my experience, and I think the normative experience is that when we're obedient and we take the next step of faithfulness, that's when we find that God leads us.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. And so I just encourage people, and it's not just for young people. It's funny. I always thought like when you're 20, okay, you got to find God's will and then you're good. Here I am in my mid 40s and I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do with my life, God? I still need guidance, right? And so just not obsessing about the long view, not looking for like signs in the sky, but just being obedient and doing the next thing.
I love the idea of get in motion, like take a step so that God can guide you. The illustration I always use is the children of Israel, they're up against the Red Sea with the Egyptians behind them. And God says to Moses, tell the people to go forward.
Wow.
And they had to make the decision to move. And then God parts the waters,
Right.
That's just such a great picture, that God directs moving vessels. We step in the direction we believe he's leading and then he leads or redirects us. Be a long haul hero.
Hard to steer a parked car. Yeah. I was just saying, hard to steer a parked car, right?
Exactly. All right. Chapter 4 is be a long haul hero. Talk about that.
Yeah. So this is something I ripped off from an author named Pete Davis. He talks about infinite browsing mode. And that's the phenomenon when you're looking at Netflix and you don't know what you want to watch. And so you sit there for 2 or 3 hours. I've done this many times, scrolling because you're not wanting, there's so many options you don't want to commit to anything. And he says that's kind of a good metaphor for how a lot of us approach life now, because we're overwhelmed by all these options and we don't want to close the door on anything. And then as a result, we end up in this weird limbo phase. Yeah. He contrasts that, though, with what he calls long haul heroes. That is people who invest deeply in a particular community, a particular calling for the long haul.
Yes.
And he talks about like his piano teacher who taught piano for 28 years in the same street in the same town, or Mr. Rogers who did all those hundreds of thousands of episodes.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good word, particularly for young people
Yeah.
that are kind of going, man, I don't want to miss out on anything, so I don't want to commit. But man, it is better to have one mission than 1,000 choices.
That is such good advice, and it's so true that you can't grow if you don't plant, and you can't
Yeah,
grow fruit if you're not really planted and digging roots, and it takes time. It takes time to
yeah,
see the fruit of the long perspective. Play the role. What do you mean in chapter 5? Play the role.
yeah. Well, sometimes I think in our time, authenticity is such a high premium for us, and maybe
Yeah.
rightfully so, right? Yeah, you don't want to be inauthentic, but I think sometimes the pendulum has swung a little far where we think that if your heart isn't in something, then you shouldn't do it, right? But the truth is, as you know, being a pastor, if you're a leader, sometimes your heart ain't in it when you get up there, and you not that you're faking it, but you are there to perform a role for people, and that sometimes takes priority. And I think that's true in all kinds of areas of life.
Yeah.
Sometimes as you perform the role, God uses you in spite of your feelings, and often when you're obedient. This applies even to the spiritual disciplines. It's like, what should I really read my Bible and pray if I'm not feeling it? Yes, absolutely,
Hmm.
right? Because if and often what happens is when you do that, like I feel like this going to church, I'll be like, oh man, I don't really want to go. It's a long drive, and it's hard to get the kids ready, and I'm not feeling it anyway. And then yet you do it all. You get in 3 fights on the way to church. You get there, then you start worshiping, and then all of a sudden something happens. Oh man, now you're feeling it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now you're connecting with God. You're
Yeah.
communing with your brothers and sisters in Christ. So there's this principle there where you can kind of be faithful, and the feelings come, not always, but more often than if you just rely on feelings
Yeah.
to get you there in the first place.
Yeah. And it is the art of learning to live by truth and substance instead
Mm,
of your emotions in the moment.
yes.
And you reference being a pastor. You're right. There's sometimes where my heart isn't there in emotional sense. It is
Hmm.
there in a devotional sense, though. You know what I'm saying?
Right, right.
In other words, the feelings ebb and flow, but the substance of my call, the significance of the power of the Word of God, the needs of the people, those are all objective realities that are real, independent of my feelings. And I'm with you, but I'll walk into a service, and usually the devil's right on my shoulder going, you're the wrong guy for the job. You got nothing to
Hmm.
say today. You're going to stumble all over yourself. You're going to stutter your way through this. You're going to forget what they're not coming back next week. I mean, all this stuff is in my head before I got to stand up and preach. But just through the song service, God starts to rein
Uh,
in those thoughts and those emotions. And it is amazing how, if you just dial into truth, feelings follow and they eventually
yes.
fall into line. I'm going to push past. You talked about Bible reading and church attendance, which is the next chapters. Let's move to chapter 8 and push on to 12 real quick. The walking in the rain concept and suffering.
Hmm. Yeah.
Unfold that for a second.
Yeah, I thought that I needed to address this because I think when it comes to this message of, faithful obedience, just showing up, it's hardest to do when you're suffering, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's, some illness, some chronic pain, whatever, or, relational problems, you name it, right? We all go through stuff. I know you have been through
Hmm.
stuff, health stuff. Um, and often when that happens, at least to me, I kind of want to check out and go, okay, I need to resolve this before I can move on to the things that God's called me to do. Unfortunately, that's impossible to do because, you got a job,
Yeah.
you got kids to pick up from school, you got, bills that keep coming. And I think most of the hardship that we encounter, some of it's just absolutely devastating where you can't keep going, but most of it's in that kind of like from annoying to incapacitating range. Um, and that's when I think this advice is the best or most needed is to just not worry about, okay, how am I going to do this for 10 years? You just take it day by day. And,
Yeah.
Jesus' advice on this is the best, right? Give no thought for tomorrow, right? For today or each day has enough trouble of its own. And that's something that gets really practical when you are in a season of discouragement or suffering where you just go, man, I'm just going to focus on today. I'm going to be faithful today and trust God for the future.
Yeah. That's such good advice. When I was sick with cancer, there were times I couldn't do anything with chemo and radiation. I was just incapacitated, but there was a lot of time in between that I could. But the struggle, you're right. The temptation was, well, I can't do what I used to do, so maybe I shouldn't do any of it.
Mm.
And what God really clearly said to me, and I wrote about it in off script, was do what you can.
Yeah.
Stay engaged to the degree that you can, and do the little that you can. It's the boy with the lunch. Give Jesus your
Mm.
Lunchable and let
Hmm.
him feed who he wants to feed with it. So, let work through your suffering, but at the same time, leverage it. Let God
Yeah.
leverage it, because you have people's attention when you speak from your suffering. It's interesting.
Mm. Isn't
Um,
that true?
yeah.
Reminds
What
me
is it?
of I forget who said it, but the authority of one who suffered, right? There
Yeah.
is a certain, especially in spiritual leadership,
Yeah.
where, and I have to admit, this is a terrible bias. I'll hear like a 25-year-old preaching who has never experienced anything hard. And I'm like, come on, man. No, it's not the years, it's the mileage. But yes, that God can definitely use your suffering.
Yeah. No, you're right. I used to be that 25-year-old. And
That's where you
everybody
rely on the word. It's okay.
everybody that knew that guy, when I see them years later, I just want to apologize. I'm so sorry. My heart was in the right place, but I needed some more maturity for sure. Um, so what does it mean to practice incarnation?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it is, like I was saying earlier, it's a commitment to be physically present for people. In the way, not to be too grandiose, but in the way that Jesus was, right?
Yeah.
Because we are his hands, we are his feet. And that is both daunting and incredibly exciting as well, to think that we can provide the presence of Jesus for people. And again, it stresses the importance of physical presence, of showing up for people. And I was mainly preaching to myself, because I do have that tendency. I have this tendency, if I'm giving in to my sinful impulses, to kind of, I just want to cordon myself off on a nice grassy hillside with me and my family and watch the muddy stream of humanity go past, and I'll
Yeah.
communicate, digitally, if anything. But that's not the way of Jesus. That is not the way of Jesus.
Right.
You got to get in there and get your hands dirty.
Yeah, we're in this, as the world gets nuttier and nuttier, I think Christians are tempted to isolate more and more in
Exactly.
self-protection and minimize our vulnerability, because the risk of serving or extending ourselves is greater.
Yes.
And yet it is so anti-gospel and anti-Jesus, at
Yep.
heart.
Yep.
What do you mean? 3 more chapters here. 10 is
Yeah, we're getting through it all. I love it.
Yeah, I do too. Let something slide. What's the principle here?
Yes. Okay. So basically, I'm encouraging people to show up for the people in their life, for their community, their family, their neighborhood, their church. But of course, you can't show up for everything. So, in the silly illustration I give, I'm looking at it right now. I had for a while this fantasy that I was going to have this perfect yard, right? And then I started researching what I'd have to do, because the soil here isn't good. I'd probably have to resod it, and then I'd have to weed and use pesticides and all that stuff. And then I had this realization, you know what? This is not the season for it, man. I got a busy career and family life and all this stuff. I don't have the time for a perfect yard, and I have to scream at kids to get off my lawn like an old man. And so right now I'm going to let that slide. That's something that's just not going to happen. Maybe in 20 years I'll have a perfect yard, but it's not going to happen right now. And I mean, that's a silly one, but I think it's good to take a hard, clear-eyed look at your commitments and your schedule, especially when you're a busy person, and go, what can I offload here? And of course, there are some things you can't, even if you would like to. They're kind of core commitments. But often I know that there are certain things that I can say no to. And one good litmus test, I think, for this is to kind of ask yourself, okay, if I drop this commitment, would my primary emotion be relief or sadness? And if it's relief, sometimes that's a good sign that maybe you don't have the skill set for that. Maybe it's too much at this point in your life, and that you need to. And then the good news is, I've found when you explain to people, hey, listen, I would love to do this, but right now, for these reasons, I can't. And there's even studies showing this. They're more forgiving than you anticipate they're going to be. They're more understanding.
Sure.
And then, of course, you are then freed up your capacity to focus on the things that matter. And that's so crucial, because sometimes we like to think we're infinite, but only God's infinite. We're finite. We got to deal with this limited bandwidth, limited time, limited energy.
This is the hardest one for me. I got to be honest, that as a pastor, there's a part of me that hates letting people down.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
talking to the idea of showing up and practicing incarnation, I want to be there. But as the church develops and grows, that has to be shared, and I
Yeah.
struggle with that because I want to be there. And on one hand, I think that's a good desire. Uh, what would it mean if I didn't want to be there for anybody?
Right.
That's not a good reflection. But there's a ditch on both sides of the roads because the
Hmm.
idea that I can or should be there for everybody would imply that I'm infinite in some way, that
Right.
I'm Jesus, and yet, man, discerning uh, who can I be there for, what can I be there for, and where do I put up the boundaries and the limits? That's the hard thing, is because everybody has an opinion about where your boundaries should be.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. Ain't that the truth? You could look into cloning yourself. That's one option.
yeah, but I don't know that
Expensive.
anybody wants more than one of me either.
Not even your wife,
No, for sure, for
especially
sure.
not your wife.
There's just something intrinsic to ministry that, and it's a product of I think just the coming together of everybody's sin nature. It means that you're inevitably going to be a letdown.
Right.
On some level, to somebody, you're going to be a letdown, and I think that's the thing I wrestle with a lot. That I feel like I let a lot of people down. Do I sound negative at this point? I don't mean to, but
Mm-mm. No.
that letting something slide is a challenge for me because that means somebody's going to be unhappy.
Yeah.
Okay, chapter 11's don't be an escape artist.
Yeah. This is another place where I was preaching myself. During the pandemic, I got into this weird habit of spending like hours on stupid apps like Redfin and Zillow. These are like real estate apps, and we have a fine house, right? It's nothing super fancy, but it's got a garage and bedrooms.
Yeah,
But then I all of a sudden realized that it was terrible because I'm looking at these other houses that have like pools and theater rooms and stuff like that, and I'm going, how did I ever survive without this? And we were kind of playing with the idea of moving a little bit, but really I was just wasting a lot of time. And it was finally Grace who was looking over my shoulder one day, and she said, "We're never going to afford a house like that." And I said, "Not with that attitude, we're not." Um, but she was right. I realized it wasn't just the creeping materialism, but it was just I was using it to check out of reality. Like when
yeah,
I was getting annoyed by the kids or, bored by my job, whatever it was, right? I just kind of like get into this little dream world where I was buying this big acreage with a 4,000 square foot house or something. And I just realized that I think a lot of people, it's, for someone else, it might be something entirely different. And of course it can be sinful things too, whether it's like porn or, I don't know, like someone who's a shopaholic or like something
yeah,
destructive, right? Or just like playing video games till 3 a.m. But it's good to look at your life and go, in what areas am I actually just trying to escape my life and
yeah,
check out?
yeah,
And then also, I think sometimes there's a spiritual dynamic to this because maybe you're not slaking that spiritual thirst in coming to God, and you're looking to. I think a lot of sins are a result of those unmet deep core desires that you're
mhm,
looking to slake or satisfy in unhealthy ways. Anyway, so yeah, I just encourage people and it can be anything, man. It can be, your phone can be that escape.
yeah.
Golf can be an escape. I don't know what it is, right? But and I'm nothing against hobbies, and you need those too.
Yeah.
But yeah, don't be an escape artist. Don't check out.
It's when good things become excessive things,
Yes,
and they
that's
become
well
more
said.
than restorative. They become ways of avoiding our core responsibilities, and
Yep.
commitments. Your final chapter is on wrestling with God. Keep wrestling with God.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is just talking about doubt. My first book was a book where I basically interviewed all these 20-somethings that had grown up in the church and then ultimately walked away not only from the church but from the faith. And so I've seen it a lot. Of course, I've dealt with doubt myself, and this was just encouraging people the same sort of thing. Keep, even as you're doubting or going through maybe a dark night of the soul or deconstructing. That's the new word, right? That where you're kind of trying to strip back the layers of your faith that maybe were things that are extra biblical and trying to understand, okay, what's the essence here. Throughout that process, keep the lines of communication with God open. That's my advice. And it's not terribly profound, but like, marriage counselors will tell you, like, the most dangerous thing in a marriage isn't when people are fighting. It's when they stop talking
Yeah.
altogether, right? When that apathy or that anger turns to apathy, and you're just not even in communication. I think the same is true of our relationship with God. Because, man, you open up Scripture, talk about people raw, angry, doubts, and disappointment direct to God, though. That's the cool thing. They didn't stop talking to God.
Yeah.
And so that's what I encourage people to do. Man, keep that open. And I think that leads ultimately to navigating doubts better and coming out even with a stronger faith on the other side.
Yeah. When the pandemic started, I started doing a daily devotion with our church family online through the Psalms. And the idea was 10, 15 minutes a day, one or two verses. And I have this goal before I die, if God extends my life, to teach through the whole Bible. And so I figured, well, the Psalms is the longest book of the Bible, and it speaks most to our emotions. And this pandemic is really rocking our emotions. So I'll just start plowing through the Psalms. Well, this is now coming into my 4th anniversary of this. We've got about 25 or 30 Psalms left to go. It's been so rich for 4 years every day in the Psalms. Wow. And then I recently just converted it over to a YouTube channel called Growing in the Gospel. So now it's a little more than that now, but we're still working through the Psalms. But I am blown away at how much negativity is aired to God.
Yes.
Doubts, frustration, despair, darkness. But when it comes into the presence of God, he receives it and he starts to reorient it, and that is, 2/3 of the Psalms, I think.
Absolutely. How long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? It's just,
Why have you cast us
great.
Off?
Yeah.
You haven't really cast us off, but it feels like you've cast us off, that kind of thing.
And God seems able and willing to take it.
Yeah. Well, I love this. This is great flyby overview, and I do hope our listeners will pick this book up. And I'm sure after this podcast, you'll probably sell another 100,000 copies.
Oh, yeah.
Just because
That's
of
awesome.
the listeners for this podcast.
Well, that'll get me to 1 million copies. So that's... And for people that don't get that, that's... people always say, oh, you published a book. How many did it sell? Like 1 million? I'm like, well, no. It's not Harry Potter here. That's...
Okay. Let's take 5 or 10 minutes and talk about steady strength. And the reason we can go quick on this is I'm going to probably do some other episodes about the subject matter of steady strength. Yeah. But you were a big part of the concept of this book. It started with a conversation with me and Trillia, and she asked me for, kind of a chapter summary, which I think she sent immediately to you. And we heard back so fast from you guys. So the question I've kind of been wanting to ask you all along is, what was it about Christian leadership and about the needs that you see that made you guys gravitate so quickly to this, and the proposal didn't sit on a shelf for 6 months waiting for you to get to it?
Yeah, no, and it's something I alluded to earlier, but it's just the current landscape of ministry where there's such a need for endurance, for resources that help Christian leaders reconnect with Jesus and make that the taproot of their ministry, rather than focusing on the metrics, on the impact, on the reach. And this was just a book that spoke to their hearts, and that's what we realized that we needed, and that you were the right guy to do it, obviously. So that was a huge part of it. It's so interesting though, and I'm not just saying this. I work on a lot of books, but this one blew me away, and it was something that I'm not a pastor, but I'm reading this and it's speaking to my soul. And I was just talking to my wife, before this podcast, I told her I was going to be on it, and I was raving about how good the book was, just kind of a spiritual tonic, especially for Christian leaders, but really for anyone. So I loved it. It was powerful and timely and desperately needed.
When Trillia said to me, we would like you to write to pastors, would you consider doing that? And she was kind of hesitant because she said assigned topics often don't go well. She said, so we want you to write what you're passionate about, but this is an area of need. Would you do it? And it set me back because I would have never assigned this to myself.
Right.
For the very reason that I'm still floundering,
Right. No one feels like they've arrived. And so, yeah, I get it.
And then it's like the Lord said, yeah, right. Like when you had cancer, you wrote off script from the depth of the experience. Why don't you write from the floundering? Write about the floundering, because that's on, these rock star pastors that are publishing books every 6 months and selling tens of thousands of them.
And they're not writing them themselves.
Well, that's
Often.
true.
Anyway,
That's true.
that's a whole other thing.
That's I won't go down that road. But that's not reality anyway, is my point. They're not
Right.
living in the normative ministry experience. And so every page of this book kicked me in the backside, and I was just sure that, when you got it, you were the first eyes on it, except for my immediate context. And I'm like, he's going to send this back to me and say, start over. So do me a favor, having read it, by the way, thank you for the work you put into it as that first read and first edit. And, but speak to the leaders,
Mm-hmm.
having had a hand in it. Why do you think it will minister to them? What jumped out to you that touches their need?
Yeah, I think it's just a reordering of your priorities, and putting your relationship, your connection to Christ first. And it's been it's probably been how long? 8-9 months since I did my edit of it.
Yeah,
So I may be a little foggy on my memory, but I remember one great phrase you had in there, and you said something about getting into the slipstream. Jesus' slipstream.
Yeah.
Am I butchering that? Is that right?
No, that was the concept, the slipstream.
Yeah. I love that. That really spoke to me, just that image. And maybe you could unpack that, actually, because I could take a stab at it. But
it's
you
built
did it far
on the
better.
promise of Jesus. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. You learn of me. I am meek and lowly, or gentle, lowly of heart. The idea of the yoke is labor. It's work. So he's called us to a work, but he defines that in his terms as an easy experience. Now, that is so counterintuitive to every day of my life. Look, ministry is hard. In human terms, it's hard. But there's something about the way Jesus sees it that he said, you're going to have a tendency by yourself to overload yourself, overwork yourself, heavy labored. And I think there's a salvation application here, that life and our sin is heavy. But I think there's a sanctification application as well, that once we have that saving relationship with Jesus, do we live in that yoke with him, or are we trying to get him in our yoke? And a lot of my life has been subconsciously me trying to do good things for God, but do them my way. Like, God, help me out here. I'm just trying to help you, And Jesus is like, no, I'm doing something. You can join me. And the idea of the yoke is that there's a strong ox and a weaker, younger ox. The strong one's doing most of the pulling. And so to me, a modern metaphor for that is slipstreaming. That, I see this jet, I picture this jet flying and taking all the bugs and the force of the wind on the windshield of the lead jet, but then the ones behind are flying in a void, a kind of a vector, gap, that the velocity is similar with less effort. The airplane flying behind can travel at almost the exact same speed with much less fuel burn. And so for me, the last 12 years in senior pastoring has been learning to stay behind Jesus. And not get in front of him. And I find that ministry gets hard when I get in front of him. And when I get behind him, it gets much, much easier. And he solves the problems in a much different way than I would. So
you're not taking bugs in the teeth.
Exactly. Exactly.
I love that. It's just such a memorable way of putting it. And so freeing. Yeah, I love that. Talk a little bit too about, I remember you talked about the necessity of having real friends in ministry.
Yeah, and in the pastorate, I think it takes years to know who those are. because you can't come at every relationship with cynicism and withholding. You really have to go at every relationship. Love believes all things. You go loving and sincere and authentic and really extending yourself genuinely. And I said to someone yesterday, in fact, I was meeting with a younger pastor yesterday, and we were talking about this. I said, you cannot genuinely love without being vulnerable to hurt. And if you're in the ministry for any length of time and you genuinely love, you're going to be hurt.
Yes.
Not everybody will hurt you, but there is a lot of hurt in the ministry, and it is just a part of loving. So when it comes to those friends, I really borrowed the idea from Arthur Brooks in a book called Strength to Strength. I don't know if you've read that book, but
I haven't. I'm aware of it.
It's a secular book, but wow, brilliant. And he talks about in that book real friends and deal friends. And the breakdown is the deal friends are those that are getting something from you. The friendship is maybe you're getting something from them. The friendship is transactional. It's based on the mutual flow of performance for each other, where real friends are the ones that you can just count on their friendship. They're not really looking to take or receive or exploit from you. They just love you, and they're cheering you on. They're rejoicing for you when you're rejoicing. They're hurting with you when you're hurt, and they're just there. And I think that those friends in ministry are few and far between.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of years. And I think every pastor is going to go through some long seasons of, it might be just you and Jesus and maybe just you and your family, or at least in the sense of it. But the years reveal who are the real friends, who are the deal friends. Yeah. And you find that the deal friends are so quick to throw you off and cancel you when you're no longer useful to them.
Right.
And that hurts, especially when you thought it was a real friend.
Yes.
And you were in it with your whole heart, but you found out they threw you away like a consumer item. But then you turn around and you realize you do have a handful of over decades of people that just walked with you and they were there. And it really, somewhere along the way, they were mature enough to learn to love you in spite of your weaknesses and your flaws and your insufficiencies. And we all need those kinds of friends, but to get them, we have to make ourselves vulnerable, and there's no way around that.
I saw a stat recently. I don't know where it came from, but it rings true. It said something about like most people lose, 6 to 8 relationships over the course of their life, like important relationships, and pastors lose that every 2 years or something. Yeah. And so, man, I just, that makes it both harder to find the real friends, I'd imagine, and more essential, because you need those non-transactional deep friendships to sustain yourself.
Yeah. It's hard to find them. And what I find myself needing to avoid is, the longer I'm at it, is the fear of being hurt again.
Yeah.
Because that makes you want to retract. It makes you want to seclude and isolate and really protect yourself from being hurt. But that means you're withholding yourself from people and from true shepherding. So it's a natural response, but it's a deadly response in terms of real ministry, because you can't pull away and still genuinely shepherd and love people.
Right.
But I'm telling you, man, wanting to guard yourself from the hurt is a very real thing. And I think you have to fall back on God's grace to salve the hurts, But
no, and it's a perennial challenge for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you let me hit you with one last question here, because I think most of the book is about that kind of soul work. Part 1, cultivating a strong core. Part 2 of the book is nurturing a flourishing soul.
Yeah.
And honestly, like I want to encourage people, this is the kind of book you read not just once, but you got to read every couple of years, I feel like, because it's just an awesome reset, and it's devotional. It's really beautiful. The last section, part 3, you talk about leading a healthy culture. Tell me how you kind of turn that corner, because and how, what's the connection between, nourishing a soul that is connected to Jesus, that's flourishing, that's healthy, that has those friendships, and then that leading to a healthier culture in your church or organization.
Yeah, this was critical. And you know what happened on this book is I ran out of words. I ran out of word count. Like, I had a limit. And I had this whole part 3 with 4 or 5 components. And I thought, man, I'm just going to have to come back and make this a different book or something. And then I had to kind of compact it into one chapter because I just was running out of runway. But here's my experience, that part 1 is kind of your aspirational, motivational, internal world. What's driving you? And in 5 chapters, I deal with all these internal concepts like motives and identity, and what do you delight in, and what are you really chasing? And it's kind of self-reflective and internal sanctification. Part 2 is the disciplines of your practices, and it's like 6 chapters. We call it 6 practices, and I would say that's like the physical and spiritual and emotional cultivation and habits that the readers need. This third component, I've never read anything that told me, hey, this is really impacting you. But your culture or your environment, what the spaces you work and live in, and the quality of those relationships is either putting life into you or sucking life out of you in major ways. And what I came to learn as I researched this was that toxic, and that word it's kind of a buzzword today, and anything can be called toxic, but legitimately toxic cultures, you can have a strong core, you can have great habits, but if you are persistently exposed to a toxic culture, you'll just die 1,000 deaths. And church culture to me has become, it's something I contribute to as a leader. I'm responsible for cultivating it, but I also partake in it.
Right.
And I know pastors that they bring frustrated, empty souls to the pulpit and to ministry context, and their attitude is bad. They're like, nobody ever thanks me. Nobody ever expresses support or love. Nobody knows what I carry. Nobody knows the burdens. And that's kind of their persona. So they kind of end up cultivating an environment that looks like that. Everybody feels that way. So they end up, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They end up breathing the air of that environment, which makes their own toxicity worse. And the culture becomes something that I like to say the church doesn't become what the pastor says it should be. It becomes what the pastor is spiritually as the leader.
Right.
Because he's either breathing life and joy and health into the culture, or he's breathing guilt and shame and grumpiness and into the culture. And he kind of gets it. It kind of boomerangs back on him and ends up slapping him in the face.
Yeah. Oh, that's sobering and very true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's true in a micro sense as well as dads and as husbands. It's like,
now this is getting too personal.
Yeah, well, your wife emailed me and said, "Hey, could you deal with this?"
I knew it.
Actually, it was your kids, but your wife signed on too.
What's funny is this Sunday our pastor preached on James 3, the tongue, and I had been a jerk that morning to my kids, I'm afraid to say, as I was, for a good cause. I was trying to get them out the door to church. And Grace, let me know what a jerk I was being. And I said, well, if no one was a jerk, we wouldn't get to church even. And then I get hit with this sermon. And then and furthermore, he stops and he says, and Dad, sometimes the way you talk to your kids and your families. And I was like, oh man, this is uncomfortable.
Oh, don't you hate it when that happens?
Hate it.
I have to tell the church family so often, look, if you think I'm talking about you right now, I'm not that smart. I don't know all of your issues. I'm just teaching you the Bible, and the Spirit of God might be talking to you.
Take it up with God.
Exactly.
If you're feeling convicted.
Okay. Last thing, Drew. I just want to thank you for your good sense of humor on Twitter, because you constantly keep me in stitches. And
Thank you.
you're one of the main reasons I'm still on Twitter. Um, Sometimes I wonder how you keep your job, how you get away with this. Um, but
Or my wife, because I make some jokes at her expense. But
there are so many times I want to retweet you, but I think, oh, I might get in trouble if I retweet that. Oh, you did. You said something the other day that it was laughable and sad and true all at the same time. Something about how not to be. The seminary classes are offering classes on how not to be a documentary.
oh yeah, well
Ooh,
I was sharing someone's, but yeah,
yeah,
that probably needed.
yeah. That was a sensitive thing, but I'm like, ooh, man, I so want to retweet that. Um, anyway, thank you for your good humor, and I would just tell
Thank you.
our listeners, if you're looking for someone that lightens the mood online, Drew, that's kind of like his ministry.
You like dad jokes too. I'm your man.
Okay, so last word of encouragement to discouraged leaders from the great Drew Dyck.
Oh wow. When you put it that way, yeah. I talk to a lot of people, and I've been here myself, who feel like God's put them on the shelf. And you thought maybe things were going to go one way, and they went a different way, or you're in a period where you're just totally feeling sidelined. And I talk about that in the book too a little bit, and look at the example of Moses, this great, he's going to be this great liberator of his people, and he ends up, murdering an Egyptian and then getting stuck in the wilderness for 40 years.
Yeah.
And that's just been a great sort of illustration for me to think through that time when you are discouraged, if you are, to realize that even in the place that you are right now, God's probably doing something you don't even understand.
Yeah.
Like for Moses, I believe he was preparing Moses. He was humbling him. He was teaching him how to lead sheep before he could lead people.
Yeah.
That was all essential.
Yeah.
And God didn't want a fancy talker. He wanted a walker, someone who's going to lead his people. And so in a similar way, if you are in a season of discouragement, and I'm not trying to say, oh, God's going to do something incredible through it, but he is going to work through it, maybe in ways you don't even understand. And he's preparing you for what's ahead. And the essential thing is, and this is the beauty of the Moses story, he didn't have to find his calling. He just had to keep tending sheep. And in the midst of doing that, God shows up and directs him. And so just be faithful in what you're doing right now, doing the next thing that God's placed in front of you, and leave the rest to God.
That is great advice. So I'd like you to just close us in prayer and pray for those that'll listen to this, and that God will encourage them through our words.
Absolutely. Dear Lord, thank you for this time to reconnect with my buddy, to laugh, to talk about the joys and the trials and the reality of ministry. I pray for each person that's listened to our conversation. I thank you for them. These folks that are in the trenches of ministry, I pray that you'd sustain them. I pray that you'd give them joy in the calling, that it wouldn't just be a slog, that you would, by the power of your Holy Spirit, empower them to do the work that you've called them to. And we will give you all the glory for what you do through it. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, I hope today's interview challenged you and encouraged you and strengthened you in the new year. I hope you've had a good start to your new year. We have some great podcast episodes scheduled upcoming months. I hope you'll stick around with us. I hope you'll tell somebody else about it, maybe share today's episode. And then finally, I just want to remind you, look for the Done book, and look for ordering those books going forward, either through Amazon or through In the Gospel. Mark your calendar for the first week of October, starting actually September 30th, for Leading in the Gospel Refuel at Disney World. Mornings, mentoring, challenging, encouraging, instructional, afternoons, parks, shopping, time with our wives. Very, very relational time away. It's a refreshing thing. Those of us that have come, I think this is our 5th or 6th year to do this. It's just been fantastic. And so I hope you'll join us. You will not regret being a part of Leading in the Gospel Refuel. And then finally, the Growing in the Gospel YouTube channel. Just simple expositional Bible teaching, the 1-year Bible journey, and some other resources on the channel. I hope these things will be a help and an encouragement to you. As we start the new year, I just want you to know that it's a privilege that you join us in this podcast. And we hope that this year will be another year of encouragement and slow walking forward in the gospel and in grace and in God's word. I hope that you will make him the fountainhead of your life source, your energy, your motivation for all that you do in ministry. And I do pray and hope and wish that this is a great, a blessed, a wonderful, encouraging year for you in the work of God. So thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep leading in the gospel.